Excuse me, ma'am. I need to see some identification. I'm sorry. What? You're in a restricted area. I need to see your ID right now. Officer, I'm wearing judicial robes. I'm a judge. This is the judge's parking garage. Ma'am, I don't know who you are. Show me identification. I'm Judge Victoria Chen, United States District Court, and you're currently detaining a federal judge in the middle of a murder trial recess. I still need to see ID. Fine. My credentials are in my chambers. I just stepped out to my car. But I suggest you verify who I am before I return to that courtroom, because this conversation is going to come up during the next police misconduct case that lands on my docket. Officer Brian Lawson had been with the U.S. Marshal Service for 7 years when he made a decision that would end his federal law enforcement career and cost the government $8.2 million. He was 34 years old, experienced enough to recognize judicial robes and understand the concept of judicial parking areas, but apparently convinced that Asian women couldn't possibly be federal judges. One Wednesday afternoon in the secure parking garage of the James R. Browning U.S. Courthouse in San Francisco, he stopped a woman in full judicial robes returning to her car during a trial recess and demanded identification. That woman was Judge Victoria Chen, a 7-year-old federal district court judge who'd been on the bench for 9 years and was currently presiding over a high-profile murder trial. What Lawson did next, refusing to accept her judicial status despite the robes, detaining her until other judges intervened, and forcing her to miss part of her own trial, would become evidence that racial bias operates even against federal judges wearing the literal uniform of judicial authority. Before we continue, where are you watching from? If this is your first time here, please hit that subscribe button. Stories like these prove that not even federal judges are safe from racial profiling, and your support helps us expose these patterns at every level. Let's continue. An Asian American woman in her late 42nd, Judge Victoria Chen, was walking through the secure judge's parking garage of the federal courthouse wearing full judicial robes, the black gown that identifies federal judges in courtrooms across America. Her judicial credentials were in her chambers on the 18th floor. Her car keys were in her hand. No security breach, no unauthorized access, no violation. Just a federal judge stepping out to her car during a trial recess to retrieve documents she'd left in her trunk. But to Officer Brian Lawson, a U.S. Marshal assigned to courthouse security with 7 years on the job and a pattern of questioning female judges and minority court staff, she looked like someone impersonating a judge. The James R. Browning United States Courthouse sits on Golden Gate Avenue in San Francisco's Civic Center. It's a massive modernist building that houses the United States District Court for the Northern District of California, one of the most important federal courts in the country. The courthouse has 15 active district judges, 7 senior judges, and 5 magistrate judges. It handles thousands of cases every year: criminal prosecutions, civil rights litigation, patent disputes, immigration appeals, constitutional challenges. The building has multiple security layers: public entrances with metal detectors and screening, restricted hallways requiring credentials, and secure parking garages reserved exclusively for judges and senior court staff. The judge's parking garage is on the basement level, accessible only by elevator from the judicial chambers, floors, and by security checkpoints. U.S. Marshals patrol the garage to ensure unauthorized personnel don't gain access. It was 2:15 p.m. on a Wednesday in late March. Judge Chen had been presiding over a murder trial since 9 a.m. The trial was in its 3rd week. The prosecution had rested 2 days earlier. The defense was presenting its case. At 2:10 p.m., Judge Chen had called a 20-minute recess so defense counsel could retrieve additional exhibits from their office. She'd used the break to step down to her car. She'd left a box of case law in her trunk that morning, research on an evidentiary issue that had come up during testimony. She needed those cases for a ruling she'd have to make when court resumed. She'd taken the elevator from her chambers on the 18th floor down to the basement parking garage, walked to her assigned spot, and was unlocking her trunk when Officer Lawson approached her. Judge Victoria Chen had been on the federal bench for 9 years. 9 years presiding over some of the most complex and significant cases in Northern California: death penalty appeals, civil rights lawsuits against police departments, environmental litigation, antitrust cases, constitutional challenges to state laws, Before becoming a judge, she'd spent 16 years as an attorney, 8 years as a federal prosecutor in the U.S., attorney's office handling white-collar crime and public corruption, and 8 years as a partner at a major law firm representing corporations in complex litigation. She tried 43 federal jury trials as an attorney, winning 38. She'd argued 2 cases before the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals. She'd published articles in the Harvard Law Review and the Yale Law Journal on criminal procedure and constitutional law. Judge Chen had earned her appointment through exceptional legal work. She'd graduated summa cum laude from Stanford with a degree in political science, then earned her JD from Yale Law School, where she'd been an editor on the Yale Law Journal. She'd clerked for a Ninth Circuit judge, then clerked for a U.S. Supreme Court Justice, one of the most prestigious positions in American law. After her clerkships, she joined the U.S. Attorney's Office, where she'd built a reputation as a brilliant prosecutor who understood complex financial schemes. Defense attorneys she'd prosecuted later recruited her to their law firm because they respected her legal mind. 9 years ago, the president nominated her for a federal judgeship. The Senate confirmed her unanimously. At 47 years old, she held a lifetime appointment as a United States District Court judge, one of the most powerful positions in the American legal system. That Wednesday afternoon, Judge Chen was in the middle of a murder trial that had national attention. The defendant was accused of killing 3 people during a robbery. The case had complex forensic evidence, contested confessions, and significant constitutional issues. Judge Chen had been managing the trial carefully, ensuring both sides followed procedure, ruling on objections, instructing the jury on the law. The recess was her first break in 4 hours. She decided to grab the case law from her car while defense counsel retrieved their exhibits. She was wearing her judicial robes because she'd be returning to the bench in 15 minutes. Federal judges wear robes in court. Everyone who works in a courthouse knows this. The black robe is the universal symbol of judicial authority. Judge Chen had unlocked her trunk and was reaching for the box of case files when she heard footsteps behind her. She turned and saw a U.S. Marshal approaching, hand resting on his sidearm, expression stern. Officer Brian Lawson was 34 years old. He'd been with the U.S. Marshal Service for 7 years, all of it assigned to courthouse security at the Browning Courthouse. The Marshal Service is responsible for protecting federal judges, securing federal courthouses, transporting federal prisoners, and ensuring courtroom safety. Lawson's job was to monitor the judge's parking garage, respond to security alerts, and prevent unauthorized access. His supervisors considered him dedicated and vigilant, which was code for overly suspicious and aggressive with people he didn't recognize. In 7 years, Lawson had compiled 9 complaints. 9. 5 involved questioning female judges about their credentials more aggressively than male judges. 2 involved stopping Asian American court staff and demanding excessive proof of identity. 1 involved detaining a Latina magistrate judge until 3 other judges vouched for her. Another involved challenging a black federal public defender's access to the garage despite her valid credentials. Each complaint was investigated by the Marshal Service Office of Professional Responsibility. Each was closed with findings of no misconduct. Lawson was counseled about his approach. He attended training on implicit bias and professional courtesy. Nothing changed. He continued treating women and minorities in the courthouse as potential security threats rather than colleagues. That Wednesday afternoon, Lawson was patrolling the judge's garage when he saw Judge Chen at her car. He saw an Asian woman in a robe, but he didn't recognize her. In his mind, that was suspicious. Judges usually had staff with them. This woman was alone. She must be impersonating a judge. He approached her immediately. Do you think U.S. Marshals assigned to federal courthouses should be required to memorize all judges' faces during orientation? Drop your answer below. Judge Chen heard the footsteps and turned. She saw a U.S. Marshal walking toward her with his hand near his weapon. She immediately understood what was happening. After 9 years on the bench, she'd seen enough to recognize bias. Excuse me, ma'am. I need to see some identification. Judge Chen straightened, still holding her car keys. I'm sorry, what? You're in a restricted area. I need to see your ID right now. Officer, I'm wearing judicial robes. I'm a judge. This is the judge's parking garage where judges are allowed to be. Lawson didn't soften. Ma'am, I don't know who you are. Show me identification. Judge Chen felt her patience evaporating. I'm Judge Victoria Chen, United States District Court for the Northern District of California. I've been on the bench for 9 years. My chambers are on the 18th floor. My parking spot is assigned, number 47, right here. And you're currently detaining a federal judge in the middle of a murder trial recess. I still need to see ID. This is where racial bias erases even the most obvious markers of authority. Officer Lawson saw an Asian woman in robes and refused to believe she was a judge. The judicial robes didn't matter. Her knowledge of courthouse geography didn't matter. Her explanation didn't matter. He'd decided she was an imposter, and nothing could override that assumption. Officer, my credentials are in my chambers on the 18th floor. I stepped down to my car to retrieve case files for the trial I'm presiding over. I need to be back in the courtroom in 12 minutes to resume that trial. I'm asking you to either verify my identity through the Marshal Service office or let me proceed. Lawson pulled out his radio. I'm calling for backup. You're calling backup? I'm a federal judge in judicial robes standing at my assigned parking spot in a secure garage. What exactly do you think I'm doing wrong? I don't recognize you, and I need to verify your identity before you leave this garage. Should U.S. Marshals face immediate suspension for detaining federal judges without verification? Let me know what you think. Judge Chen looked at her watch. She had 11 minutes before court resumed. A jury was waiting. Attorneys were waiting. A murder defendant was waiting, and she was being detained by a marshal who couldn't accept that an Asian woman might be a federal judge. Fine. Call your backup, call your supervisor, call the chief judge if you want, but do it quickly, because I have a courtroom full of people waiting for me to return to the bench. Lawson keyed his radio. Garage security to Marshal's office. I need a supervisor to the judge's parking level. I've got someone in judicial robes claiming to be a judge but refusing to provide ID. I'm not refusing. My credentials are in my chambers. I've identified myself. I've told you my courtroom number. You have multiple ways to verify who I am. You're choosing not to use any of them. Within 3 minutes, 2 more marshals arrived. One was Lawson's immediate supervisor, Chief Deputy Marshal Robert Hayes, a 19-year veteran who knew every judge in the building by sight. He stepped off the elevator, saw Judge Chen standing at her car in judicial robes, with Lawson blocking her path, and his face went pale. Judge Chen, what's going on? Judge Chen's voice was cold. Chief Hayes, Officer Lawson here, has detained me for the past 5 minutes because he doesn't believe I'm a judge despite my robes, my explanation, and my offer to verify my identity. I'm due back in court in 8 minutes to resume a murder trial. Hayes turned to Lawson. You stopped Judge Chen? Sir, I didn't recognize her. I was following security protocols. Security protocols? She's wearing judicial robes. She's standing at a parking spot in the judge's garage. And you detained her? Hayes' voice dropped to something dangerous. Do you understand what you just did? Lawson's confidence finally cracked. Sir, I've never seen her before. She's a federal judge. You're supposed to know every judge in this building. That's your job. Hayes turned to Judge Chen. Your Honor, I am profoundly sorry. This is completely unacceptable. Judge Chen checked her watch. 7 minutes. Chief Hayes, I appreciate the apology, but I need to get back to my courtroom. We'll discuss this later. She grabbed the box of case files from her trunk, closed it, and walked toward the elevator. Lawson stood frozen, finally understanding the magnitude of his mistake. He detained a federal judge, the very judges who could destroy law enforcement careers with a single ruling. Judge Chen returned to her courtroom at 2:33 p.m., 3 minutes late. The jury, attorneys, defendant, and court staff had been waiting. She took the bench, apologized for the delay, and resumed the trial. But her mind was also processing what had just happened. 9 years as a federal judge, 9 years presiding over cases in this courthouse, 9 years with chambers on the 18th floor, and a U.S. Marshal assigned to protect judges had detained her because he couldn't imagine an Asian woman as a federal judge. After court adjourned at 5 p.m., Judge Chen filed a formal complaint with the U.S. Marshals Service. She also did something more significant. She requested Lawson's complete personnel file. Federal judges have authority to review security arrangements in their courthouses. That includes reviewing personnel files of security officers. Lawson's file contained 9 complaints in 7 years, 5 involving female judges, 2 involving Asian American staff, 1 involving a Latina magistrate, another involving a black attorney. The pattern was undeniable. The next morning, Judge Chen received a call from the chief judge of the Northern District, asking her to meet about the incident. By the end of that meeting, the chief judge had contacted the director of the U.S. Marshals Service. A federal judge had been detained by courthouse security. This wasn't a local issue. This was a federal crisis. Should federal judges have authority to ban specific marshals from their courthouses? Drop your answer. Within 48 hours, the story had spread through the federal judiciary. A sitting district court judge had been detained in the judge's parking garage while wearing judicial robes. The incident was discussed at the Ninth Circuit Judicial Conference. The Federal Judges Association issued a statement expressing concern. The director of the U.S. Marshal Service personally called Judge Chen to apologize and promise a full investigation. Officer Brian Lawson's federal career imploded within days. The U.S. Marshal Service placed him on administrative leave. The Office of Professional Responsibility launched an investigation reviewing not just this incident, but Lawson's entire 7-year record. What they found was devastating. 9 complaints, showing a clear pattern of targeting women and minorities, all investigated individually, but never analyzed collectively. Counseling and training that never changed behavior, and a courthouse security officer who didn't know the judges he was supposed to protect. Lawson's union representative attempted to defend him. They argued he'd been following security protocols, that judges sometimes removed their robes and looked like regular people, that he couldn't be expected to recognize every judge. The defense collapsed when investigators pointed out several facts. Judge Chen was wearing judicial robes, the universal symbol of judicial authority. She'd identified herself by name and courtroom number, information that could be verified in seconds. She'd been on the bench for 9 years, longer than Lawson had worked in the building, and most damaging, Lawson had 9 prior complaints showing he consistently questioned women and minority judges and staff, while rarely questioning white male judges. The investigation also revealed something troubling. The Marshal Service provided new officers with a briefing book containing photos and biographies of all judges in the courthouse. Lawson had received this book 7 years earlier. Judge Chen's photo was in it. He'd had 7 years to learn the faces of the judges he was supposed to protect. He'd chosen not to. Lawson was terminated 11 weeks after the incident. The termination letter was devastating. Deputy Marshal Lawson detained a United States District Court judge who was wearing judicial robes and standing in the judge's parking garage. Despite Judge Chen identifying herself and offering verification, Deputy Lawson refused to accept her judicial status. This incident, combined with 9 prior complaints showing a pattern of questioning female judges and minority court personnel more aggressively than white male judges, demonstrates Deputy Lawson lacks the judgment and professionalism required for federal law enforcement. His employment is terminated effective immediately. Lawson's name was entered into the federal law enforcement personnel database. He would never work federal security again. He did not appeal the termination. He released no statement, but the incident had broader implications. Judge Chen filed a formal complaint with the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, arguing that the Marshal Service had created a hostile work environment by allowing an officer with 9 documented complaints to continue targeting women and minorities in the courthouse. The EEOC investigation was comprehensive, reviewing all 9 complaints, interviewing other judges and court staff, examining Marshal Service training and supervision. The findings were damning. The Marshal Service had documented Lawson's pattern but failed to act. 9 complaints over 7 years, all following the same pattern, all closed without recognizing systemic bias. Female judges reported feeling they had to prove their identity more aggressively than male judges. Minority court staff reported being questioned about their credentials more frequently. And the Marshal Service had done nothing. Judge Chen also consulted with federal employment attorneys about a civil lawsuit. Suing the federal government is complex, but the facts were extraordinary. A federal judge detained by federal security in her own courthouse while wearing judicial robes. The attorneys advised her that the case had significant merit. both for the individual incident and for the systemic failure to address Lawson's pattern. Judge Chen filed a federal lawsuit 14 weeks after the incident. The lawsuit named Deputy Marshal Brian Lawson, Chief Deputy Marshal Robert Hayes for failure to adequately supervise the U.S. Marshal Service and the Department of Justice. The claims were extensive: discrimination based on race and gender in violation of Title VII, hostile work environment created by allowing an officer with documented bias to remain in position, interference with judicial duties in violation of federal law protecting judges, intentional infliction of emotional distress through detention while wearing judicial robes, and deprivation of rights under color of federal authority. The lawsuit included Lawson's complete complaint history: 9 complaints in 7 years, 5 involving female judges, 2 involving Asian American staff, 1 involving a Latina magistrate, another involving a black attorney. All documented, all closed, all ignored. The pattern that anyone reviewing the file honestly would recognize immediately. The Department of Justice, which defends federal agencies in civil rights cases, reviewed the evidence. A federal judge, detained in judicial robes in the judge's parking garage by an officer with 9 documented complaints. During a murder trial recess, the facts were catastrophic. DOJ attorneys knew no jury would side with the Marshal Service. The settlement would be massive. They recommended immediate resolution with maximum compensation. 26 months after the incident, the federal government settled for $8.2 million, one of the largest settlements ever paid in a case involving a federal judge. The settlement included requirements that the Marshal Service implement mandatory photo recognition training for all courthouse security personnel, establish a 3-complaint threshold for pattern investigation, require immediate supervisory notification when any judge is questioned about credentials, and create an independent oversight board with judicial representation to review security conduct. Should federal judges receive automatic settlements when detained by courthouse security? Let me know in the comments. Judge Victoria Chen testified before the Senate Judiciary Committee 20 months after the incident. The committee was holding hearings on security and discrimination in federal courthouses. Her testimony was precise, controlled, and absolutely devastating. I'm Judge Victoria Chen, United States District Court for the Northern District of California. I've been on the federal bench for 9 years. Before that, I spent 16 years as an attorney, 8 as a federal prosecutor, and 8 as a law firm partner. I graduated from Stanford and Yale Law School. I clerked for a Ninth Circuit judge and a Supreme Court justice. I've presided over hundreds of trials and written over 400 published opinions. She paused, looking at each senator, and none of that mattered when Deputy Marshal Lawson saw me in the judge's parking garage. He saw an Asian woman in judicial robes and decided I couldn't possibly be a federal judge. I was wearing robes, the literal uniform of judicial authority. I identified myself by name and courtroom number. I explained I was in the middle of a trial recess. He still detained me and called for backup. Her voice grew harder. What makes this particularly troubling is that Deputy Lawson had 9 complaints in 7 years. 9. 5 involved female judges being questioned more aggressively than male judges. 2 involved Asian American court staff being required to provide excessive proof of identity. Every complaint showed the same pattern: women and minorities treated as potential threats, while white male judges walked past without being questioned. She leaned forward. The U.S. Marshal Service knew about these complaints. They investigated each one. They counseled Deputy Lawson. They sent him to training. And they left him in position where he could continue targeting women and minorities. It took him detaining a federal judge in judicial robes before they finally recognized the pattern. Her tone became ice. I want you to understand what this means. Federal judges have lifetime appointments precisely so we can make decisions without fear of retaliation. We're supposed to be independent, protected, able to rule on controversial cases without worrying about consequences. But if federal judges can be detained by courthouse security because of our race or gender, then that independence is compromised. If I have to worry that a U.S. Marshal will question whether I belong in my own courthouse, then how can I fairly preside over cases involving the Marshal Service? How can any minority judge trust that security personnel see us as colleagues rather than threats? The hearing room was absolutely silent. Should Congress mandate that all federal courthouse security personnel complete judicial recognition certification annually? Drop your answer. This wasn't just about one detention. This was about a system that documented 9 complaints showing Deputy Marshal Lawson's pattern of bias and did nothing until he detained a federal judge. 5 complaints involving female judges, 2 involving Asian American staff, 1 involving a Latina magistrate, another involving a black attorney. The pattern screamed discrimination. The documentation demanded removal. But the Marshal Service treated each complaint as isolated, never connecting them, never acknowledging what they collectively proved. Lawson's supervisors had noted in evaluations that he was dedicated but sometimes overly cautious about security. That was code. What they meant was he questioned women and minorities excessively while waving white men through without scrutiny. They saw it, they documented it, and they did nothing because addressing it would require admitting the Marshal Service had a discrimination problem. The system failed at every level. Investigators who reviewed complaints failed to analyze patterns. Supervisors who worked with Lawson daily failed to recognize his bias. Training officers who conducted implicit bias sessions failed to create accountability when training didn't change behavior. And Marshal Service leadership failed to prioritize judicial dignity and equal treatment over protecting a problem officer. Brian Lawson's career is over. That's justice. The government paid $8.2 million. That's compensation. The Marshal Service implemented new protocols. That's reform. But none of that changes what happened to Judge Chen. None of that erases the humiliation of being detained in judicial robes in her own courthouse. None of that restores what was taken. The dignity of walking through her workplace without being questioned, the respect her lifetime appointment commands, the basic assumption that a federal judge in robes is actually a federal judge. The real question is, what changes now? Do federal law enforcement agencies finally track complaint patterns after 3 incidents instead of ignoring them through 9? Do U.S. Marshals finally learn every judge's face in the courthouse where they work? Do we finally acknowledge that women and minority judges face discrimination even from the officers supposed to protect them? Because if we don't fix the systems that kept Lawson in position through 9 complaints, if we don't address the bias that taught him Asian women can't be federal judges, then we're just waiting for the next marshal, the next judge, the next judicial robes ignored, the next lifetime appointment disrespected. Comment if you believe this should be law. U.S. Marshals, who detain federal judges without immediate verification, face automatic termination and permanent disqualification from federal law enforcement. And if you think these stories matter, if you believe federal judges should be safe from racial profiling in their own courthouses, then hit that subscribe button right now. We're going to keep exposing how bias operates, even against the most powerful legal positions in America. We're going to keep demanding agencies fire officers after 3 complaints, not 9. We're going to keep fighting for the federal judges, the magistrates, the court personnel who earn their positions and deserve to work without being treated as security threats. This isn't just about one marshal or one judge. It's about whether we're willing to accept a federal judiciary where even judges in robes aren't safe from discrimination by the very people supposed to protect them.